I was asked if I could make a video showing some of the differences between the Brown action from 1867 and a more standard modern grand piano action. There are quite a number of similarities and quite a number of differences. Okay, the main similarities between these two actions are kind of obvious, I think. The key, as I pointed out, in both systems is a teeter-totter or a fulcrum lever that has a padded catch on the back that is designed to catch the hammer on the rebound so that it doesn't hit the string more than once. And both systems, of course, have a hammer, which is a piece of wood with felt wrapped around it so that it gives a nice soft rebound to the strings. And both systems have that hammer mounted on a shank, hinged back here on a rail. Where the actions differ the most is in how they handle the mechanics between the key and the shank. One aspect of those systems that they have in common, though, is the presence of the L-shaped jack. The jack is the prime energy transferring element into the shank. The pressure from the jack goes through the underhammer and into the underside of the shank and moves the shank up. Over here, the system has what's called a whippin'. It's a triangular item here. So the key doesn't push directly on the bottom of the jack. It pushes on, another lever to which the jack is attached, and it pushes up on the shank. Basically the same thing. And in both systems, the L-shaped jack has a button that it comes in contact with as the hammer nears the strings. The button pulls the jack out from underneath whatever driving surface that is pushing against, and the hammer is allowed to rebound. If this jack can't pop out of the way, and this model up here is in poor enough condition that I can show you what happens if it couldn't do it, the hammer would just go, that's it. No ring, just clunk, clunk, clunk. However, that jack popping out of the way just an eighth of an inch or so, you can get escapement so that the string can ring. You get back checking so that this hammer doesn't go, which it can if it's called bobbling if that happens. But and upon release, both systems have springs that lift up on a lever, push back on the back of the key, or the back of the jack rather, both here and there, both with the intention of pulling the jack back into its notch, and in this case I think it's slowing the descent of the hammer so that the jack always beats it into its place. Whereas the modern action, that lever has the capacity to actually raise the hammer up, thus helping the jack get back under the knuckle more quickly. Perhaps that's why this action eventually took over the market and this fell behind. But as I said before, this was a well-regarded action for 50 years. So one more point of similarity I want to make is this spring. This is what we tend to call a butterfly spring, in that it's one spring, starts there, goes in there, wraps around, comes around, and it has a tendency to spread. This action up here has the springs separated. There's one spring that lifts up on the balancier and a separate spring that pushes down on the back of the jack. This is a whipping for a Steinway grand. And if you'll notice, it has a true butterfly spring in it. Starts there, wraps around, and goes down in there. Whether it's a better system than this, I will say that this is an awful lot easier to adjust, but this is a very stable system when set up right. It works very well, and Steinway's used it for 100 and God knows how many years. So, but the butterfly spring is another thing that is what might be considered a nice sophisticated detail in what you might think of as, or initially think of as a primitive action. Now the differences between these two actions are pretty big, and as I said, not as big as they might seem. In both of them, the jack pops out from underneath the knuckle, or it pops out from underneath a surface, let's just call it that, to make clearance for back checking. In both systems, a lever is compressed in that process. This one is this lever right here, see? In both systems, when you release the back checking, the spring helps to spread the lever from the jack. Again here, the lever from the jack. Get that back under there. And I showed you how on the Steinway whipping, those would be, two springs would be loaded together. One of the subtleties of that is that as the balancier gets compressed and the jack gets pushed back, both of those tensions being fed into the same spring would accentuate the springing effect, as opposed to having two springs absorb each a half of that strength. Might work out the same way mathematically, but they are different. And this has a bit more mass involved, a bit more machining. So let the controversy rage. The other difference is the driving surface. In the modern action, the driving surface on the underside of the shank, so here's the shank and you have a driving surface on the underside of both of them. This is called the knuckle or the roller. And as the hammer goes through its stroke, you can see how its surface sort of rolls along the top of the balancier there, sort of always presenting a perpendicular surface to the top of the jack, the best surface to drive on, until it gets up to close to the strings and it pops out. On the Brown action, that driving surface is not attached to the bottom of the shank. It's actually attached, it's actually the end of what they call it the underhammer. I guess it's a repetition lever of sorts. But down at the underside of it is where the jack presses against buckskin and sits in a notch. And up at the top there's a little layer of felt that presses into a platen on the underside of the shank. And it seems to sit in basically one small zone, really close to the center to drive the shank. And the jack just pops out after let off. They both have a rounded felted driving surface, but it's just in this action it's attached to the key or attached to the shank, and in this action it's attached to the repetition lever. And the other great difference, as I've mentioned before, I think, is that just the jack itself, rather than being mounted to an intermediate lever, this is the whipping body, like that, it's simply mounted to the key itself. This makes for a, I suppose, a simplified geometry, because in the grand, there's all these key ratios. The distance from here to here measured against the distance from here to here is how effective the key is. You know, X amount of weight here produces X amount of lift over here, and X amount of movement here produces X amount of movement here, and X amount of movement here produces X times something here, and that's transferred up here, and it produces another ratio of movement here, and between all of them you get about 3/8 of inch movement here equals all of that movement there, and the pop out movement and everything all put into the formula. But there's a bunch of multipliers in there. This has basically your key multiplier, which is pretty close to 1-to-1, and the jack is tied tight here, so there's not much of a multiplier there. The main multiplier is that tiny distance from the shank center to the driving point on the platen, I haven't done the actual math, but it looks like it's probably close to 10 to 1. And so if this is just a very small multiplier, and that's a large one, they both work out to be about a 6 to 1 ratio, which is what the human finger kind of likes. If I can think of any other differences or similarities between these two actions, I will try and bring them up subsequently, but at the moment I'm going to take this all away and take a good close look at the Brown action itself in its own glories.